Hello. George Orwell is a long-standing favorite author of mine, so I'm so glad that there are the Orwell Prizes, which honor new writing and journalism, which are seen to be continuing with George Orwell's aspiration to make political writing into an art. So there are different categories for nonfiction and for journalism, but also for fiction, and this is so fantastic because I feel like fiction engages with our emotions and our imagination in such a unique way while stirring lots of political ideas. So the shortlists for all of the categories were announced recently, and I'll put a link below to the prizes website so you can find out more about these prizes. And the prize very kindly sent me the shortlist for the political fiction category. So these are the 8 books that have been listed. They're a mixture of some books that I have read, some books that I have not read, but that I've been wanting to read. So this is really exciting to see. I'm going to give breakdowns of each of these books with short summaries of them and any thoughts or information about them, especially how they relate to politics. And it's a really interesting diversity of books, not just from the authors, but also the subject matters that are tackled, and some from different historical time periods, but also the styles of the narrative that are used in all of these different books. So yeah, I'm looking forward to going through each of these. I'd love to know if you've read any of these books or if you are interested in reading any of these books. But before I start talking about them, I have something very exciting to show you and something very in advance to show you because obviously George Orwell is so famous for his novel 1984. There is a new novel coming out later this year, which I just got an advance copy of, called Julia by Sandra Newman. And this is told and focusing on the perspective of Julia, who is Winston's lover in 1984. So it's a retelling of 1984, focusing on Julia. And Sandra Newman is such a fascinating writer, and she had the approval from the Orwell estate to write this book. So yeah, this is so exciting, and I can't wait to see how she executes this. This isn't going to be published until October, so it is very much in advance, and I love how they printed on this. Big Brother is watching you, Eric Anderson. So I'm hoping to reread 1984 before starting to read this, because it's been quite a while since I read this great classic. So if any of you would like to join me in reading or rereading this novel, please let me know, and hopefully we can have a discussion about it and really dive deep into this book before getting into how Sandra Newman has recreated this story with her new novel. So yeah, that is really great. Now there's also a festival going on for the Orwell Foundation is having a whole festival with a number of different really interesting events in June. And I just booked tickets for this the other day. I'm not sponsored to talk about this, but I'm just so excited about this. There's going to be an event with Jesse Armstrong, the creator of the series Succession, and like many other people, I've been obsessed with watching this series recently, not only for all of the family strife and interesting character studies that go on in this show, but also its engagement with politics and showing how these media corporations are kind of controlling the political directions of our countries and our world, and how that has been rapidly changing in the past few years. So I'm so interested to hear him talk in more depth about this series. Now, at the culmination of this festival, the winners for this year's Orwell Prizes will be announced. These are the previous winners in the political fiction category. I've read all of them, all such fantastic books. I was so happy to see Claire Keegan's very short but incredibly powerful novel Wynn last year. So really highly recommend all of these books as well. Now, to start off, looking at this year's shortlist, there is is a novel which was one of my favorite books that I read last year. I made a whole video saying that this book should win all of the awards, so of course I'm thrilled to see it nominated for yet another book prize. That is Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver, which very conveniently has just come out in paperback here in the UK. And this story about a mixed race boy that is born into poverty in the Appalachian Mountains of Virginia, who comes from a very difficult family situation that is bounced around between foster care and that struggles with drug addiction. It is such a beautiful and harrowing story following his journey, and how Barbara Kingsolver was inspired by Dickens' classic David Copperfield to give this modern retelling of a young man narrating his own journey through this very difficult process to adulthood and all of the issues and problems he encounters, largely because of political issues in modern day America, to do with poverty, to do with racism, and to do with drug addiction, specifically referencing the Oxycontin epidemic occurring in America. And if you've read Patrick Radden Keefe's nonfiction book, Empire of Pain, Patrick Radden Keefe, who's a previous winner of the Orwell Prizes, you will understand the history of this epidemic. But it's something that has touched upon so many people's lives, that has been reported on widely, and how she incorporates that into this novel in a way that gives you such a strong feeling for the repercussions, the real physical and emotional and financial repercussions of this problem. It is so powerful, it is so engaging, it is so well written that I'm just going to continue raving about this book. Small Worlds by Caleb Azumah Nelson, a brand new novel that I only just read very recently. A moving story that is following the coming of age of Stephen as he makes the uneasy transition from his teenage years to adulthood, of going to university for the first time and getting a job and trying to figure out what he wants to do with his life, both professionally and romantically, and his changing connection with his family, learning more about his family's story and his family history. But it is also a very politically engaged tale. It references the 2011 shooting of a black man named Mark Dugan, who was shot and killed by British police officers, and how this resulted in a series of protests and riots, and it frames how this is connected to history of this and the marginalization of black people in British society. So how it shows his changing sense of self over time and understanding of himself, how it incorporates into that the language of this story Ghanaian words in a way which is so effective and meaningful, and how he travels back to Ghana at one point to explore his family history, but also the history of his ancestors. It's such an emotional and sensitively told story. After Sappho by Selby, Wynn, Schwartz, this is a very inventively told narrative. It's a novel which was also longlisted for last year's Booker Prize. It relates the stories of a series of European women from the late 1800s through to the early 1900s, as they are in a process of discovering themselves and reinventing themselves, and are awakened to the political situation around them. In some ways, it's about laying the foundation for modern day feminism, and these are real historical women, so it's a mixture of fact and fiction and how their tales kind of link up to each other and combine both physically and through the subject matter that they're exploring to tell this larger story. A House for Alice by Diana Evans. This is a novel very much about modern day London, following a family in their everyday lives with their joys and their love for one another, but also their strife and their conflict. And it's set with the backdrop of really large-scale political changes and turmoil in England. So the Grenfell disaster is referenced in this, as well as much larger like political conflicts. And this is a sequel to Diana Evans' novel Ordinary People, which is a novel that I felt quite like mixed about. There were lots of elements of it that I found really engaging and interesting, but I did have some issues with it as well. So I've not read this yet, but I am really interested in reading it because I do enjoy it when authors find particular characters and like a family to trace throughout a number of novels to show how the political changes in a country are affecting people personally. Birnam Wood by Eleanor Catton, a novel which could be characterized as an eco-thriller because there are lots of very suspenseful parts to this novel, but really only later on when the plot of the novel really amps up and comes into focus, because a lot of this novel is quite a like in-depth character study of a number of different like quite fascinating characters and how she goes into their psychology and their different ideologies is really interesting, but it is also very much about how capital enterprise comes into conflict with ecological concerns and the environment, and so this really comes to a head in this novel in a very dramatic way. The New Life by Tom Crewe. This was the very first novel that I read this year and is also one of my favorite books from this year so far. It begins in 1894 in London with a character named John who has been married for many years and has a number of children who are now adults, but who has also been harboring a secret about his sexuality. And when he meets another man that he wants to settle down with and have a domestic life with, he decides he doesn't want to live a lie anymore. So it's about the conflict of this, about how he is a writer and wants to enact large-scale change by co-authoring a book about issues to do with sexuality, and this is all set against the backdrop of the Oscar Wilde trials, and so it shows how, which I'd never thought of before reading this story, about how those trials affected other homosexuals living in England at the time, because of course at that time homosexuality was a criminal offense and you could be persecuted for it. And so to live out openly like this was a very daring thing to do, but also the massive complications this causes in the lives of people around him, especially his wife. So it explores this all in a really complex and nuanced and interesting way. The Story of the Forest by Linda Grant, with its very colorful cover. This is a novel about a girl named Mina who in the year 1913 in Latvia encounters a group of revolutionary boys, and this inspires political ideas and sentiments in her, which she maintains and develops as she moves to England and gets involved with the changing society of the time. It sounds like such an interesting story that I am really drawn to reading because I have Latvian heritage, so I'm really interested in reading a story that begins in Latvia Sappho, but I've also really enjoyed Linda Grant's books that I've read in the past, so I'm looking forward to this new novel. And finally, on the shortlist, there is Bournville by Jonathan Coe, a novel which begins in 1945 with a girl named Mary who's living in the city of Birmingham, which is famous for having a chocolate factory in it, and it follows 75 years in her life. So changes in her family, changes to do with this factory and the economy of the country, but also larger political changes occurring in British society. So looking at many different big events in this country through this personal lens, all the way from the coronation through to the recent pandemic. And so, yeah, I really love when fiction, looks at these larger changes in our society through this personal lens. I've not read this yet, but I've really enjoyed Jonathan Coe's fiction in the past, and I know this novel was in a lot of the top fiction lists at the end of last year, so it's one I've been meaning to get to. So this is the entire shortlist for the political fiction category. Lots of great novels that I would recommend and more that I'm wanting to explore, so this is a really great list. And what will win? I'm not really sure. It's so tough to call, because obviously Demon Copperhead is one that I would really be rooting for and wanting to win, but it's been getting so much prize attention. I can understand the sentiment of like, let some other books win the award, and some of these books are less well known, so it would be great to see them get that boost as well. But I'm not a judge. I don't have to decide, and I can just enjoy all of these books. So that's a wonderful thing about it. So I'd love to know if you have read any of these books, or if you are interested in reading any of these books now, or if you want to recommend some of the best politically engaged fiction that you've read recently. I would love to hear about that in the comments below. But yes, also let me know if you want to join in a rereading of 1984. This is going to be so interesting to get back into, and I'm sure I'm going to have such a different perspective on this now than I did when I read it when I think I was in my late teenage years. So thank you for watching. I hope you're doing well and reading good things, and I will speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.